You sitting there is ruining my entire dinner table, Calissa. The words sliced into my ear like a cold blade dropping into the golden glow of the banquet and making even the candle flames tremble. Jade Ellington stood there, lips curled, eyes sharp, arrogant enough to believe a few contemptuous lines could crush me. The woman she assumed was nothing more than a lower-class intruder in her world. I didn't react. I sat upright, hands resting on my lap, staring straight into those venom-filled eyes. Because I know this well, when a lion is silent, it isn't scared. It's choosing the perfect moment to bite through whatever needs to be destroyed. Jade kept smirking, convinced she had put me in my proper place with a wilted salad and a chair shoved into the darkest corner. But right then, fate had already decided who would be the one sitting and who would end up kneeling. I only needed a single moment, a soft thud. The bankruptcy file of Jade's family slipped from her bag, exposing everything she had buried her entire life. And then the door slid open. A mysterious guest stepped in, bowing deeply before me, his voice clear and deliberate. "Madam Calissa Monroe, all your projects have been officially approved." No one breathed, no one moved, but I heard it vividly, the sound of Jade's pride cracking, shattering at my feet like glass. Fire. Do you want to hear how Jade paid for her own arrogance with every word she once threw at me? Comment devil so I can open the next part where every insult she ever spoke comes back to crush her. Hit follow now because what comes next will be sharper, darker, and even more breathtaking. I am Calissa Monroe, a dark-skinned woman, born and raised in a world where society always judged me with cautious, measuring eyes. My growing years were never paved with roses, but that harshness shaped me into someone who knows how to stand straight, listen carefully, and observe every small shift in people's hearts. Someone once said, women of African descent like me have to be twice as strong to be seen as half as capable. I never denied that, and I never bowed my head because of it. They looked at me with prejudice, I looked at them with experience, and that alone was enough for me to live unafraid of anyone's shadow. I never flaunt what I own. Even though I run a healthcare system many people quietly respect, I choose to walk through life with the calm silence of someone who understands the true weight of power. Real power doesn't need to boast. It reveals itself in every step, every sentence, every breath. I hide my identity not to play the role of someone poor, but to see exactly who stands before me when they believe I am nothing. People show their true nature only when they think you are beneath them. Marcus, my son, is someone I have always been proud of. He has a warm heart, a gentle nature, and just enough intelligence to avoid being reckless. But in love-kindness, sometimes makes a person more easily led than firmly grounded. Marcus isn't foolish, but he also isn't experienced enough to understand that kindness must be placed in the right person to blossom into something good. He loves Jade Ellington, a woman who is beautiful, sharp, ambitious, and carries herself as if the world owes her recognition. I don't hate Jade. I simply see something too sharp to trust in her eyes, too cold to touch, and too proud to admire. The first time Jade asked about my job, it was merely polite conversation, but her tone carried more control than concern. She rested her hand on the table, lifted her chin slightly, and asked, "You work in caregiving? Is that job doing all right?" The way she split that question made it clear the focus wasn't on job, but on all right. She wanted to measure where I stood in relation to her own confidence. I simply smiled and replied, "All right, enough that no one dares to judge." That was all it took to shift the current in the room. I don't blame Jade for wanting control. Those who've been deeply hurt often build entire walls out of coldness around themselves. But I understood that what she wanted to control wasn't just me, but also the image of Marcus's family, shaping everything into something that benefits her. To her, love isn't just connection, but territory, authority, and positioning. Marcus stood between two very different women. On one side was his mother, who understood life through long years of collisions. On the other was the woman he loved, full of ambition and ready to do anything to keep what she held. My son is good, but not yet clear-headed enough to distinguish truth from imitation, not experienced enough to hear the tremble in a liar's voice or see the excess confidence in someone terrified of losing everything. Between Jade and me, there wasn't open warfare at first, but there was a quiet space simmering like embers buried beneath ash. One small wind would be enough to ignite it. I knew that, and Jade knew it, but neither of us said a word. The air between us always carried a metallic chill, something that made you alert rather than comfortable. Then, one evening, as the family gathered before my grandchild's upcoming birthday event, the living room door opened softly. Evelyn Ellington, Jade's mother, stepped in with eyes sharp enough to slice the air. She looked me up and down, her face not bothering to hide its displeasure, and said a sentence only the naive would dare to spit out. My family doesn't like interacting with common people. For a moment, the room went still, and I knew our story truly began right then. Jade called me on an afternoon when the sky had just cleared, her voice softer than usual, but hiding thin layers of thorns. I heard that sweetness only as a veil covering her real intention. She invited me to my grandchild's birthday and emphasized that she wanted me there. Yet from the very first second, I sensed the air of an invitation that carried no spirit of welcome. It felt like the appointment of someone arranging a chess match where I was the piece she wanted to move as she pleased. Anyone who had spent enough time in Jade's world would recognize this feeling, a certain coldness behind her words, even when she coated it with sugar. She spoke lightly, as if trying to create the illusion of warmth. "Make sure you dress simple, okay, Mom? It's a small party. Don't stand out too much." I smiled, not because I was pleased, but because I recognized the setup embedded in each word. Jade wanted all eyes to stay on her, not on anyone else. She was always afraid of losing her center position, and my presence made her feel the need to defend her place. I told her calmly that I would arrive on time. She went quiet for a few seconds, as if waiting for me to question her, but I didn't give her the chance. My silence made her falter a little, and she ended the call with a strained thank you. I stood before the pastry shelf and chose a 3-tier cake, a family recipe passed down by 3 generations of women. That cake was a heritage piece, something I only made for truly meaningful occasions. I brought it to celebrate my grandchild, but also to see who would reveal themselves that night. Each layer, each flavor carried a part of my memory, something Jade couldn't measure with her scrutinizing gaze. As I placed the cake into its box, I remembered what my mother used to say, that family gatherings were always where people revealed their truest nature. It reminded me to stay very alert for the night ahead. The afternoon moved slowly, and as I opened my phone to reread Jade's message, I suddenly received one that had been sent to the wrong person. It wasn't meant for me, yet it appeared on my screen like an arrow carrying Jade's true shape. The message displayed clearly, "Remind her not to draw attention." I looked at that line, not angry, not surprised, just seeing my own thoughts about Jade being confirmed. Jade feared I would stand out, feared I would disrupt the spotlight she had constructed around herself, feared people might look at me and change their perception of Marcus's family. I replied with a short but heavy sentence. The truth draws attention on its own, no reminder needed. After sending it, I knew Jade would understand immediately that I had seen through the illusion she tried to create. I did not need long explanations to show her that I knew where I belonged and also knew exactly where she was trying to place me. Someone who had walked quietly through life like I had, facing every kind of person, would not be shaken by such amateur psychological games. But I took note of them because they were warnings about an unsettled night ahead. I placed the cake in the trunk of my car, locked it, then sat behind the wheel for a few minutes to gather my thoughts. I knew clearly that this birthday night would not be simple. Jade was preparing a performance she believed would make me feel smaller. Yet those who tried to shrink me always forgot one thing, that a person's true size is never decided by lights, tables, or seating arrangement, but by how they face the truth. My phone rang again. It was my closest friend, the one who understood me better than anyone. Her voice was low, firm, carrying a clear warning. "She's planning to humiliate you in front of the whole family." I heard that sentence, my hand still resting on the steering wheel, and felt as though the door to the birthday night had just cracked open, revealing the undercurrent Jade had poured all her effort into. And that was the moment I knew everything was truly about to begin. I arrived as the sky shifted into the deep blue of evening, the lights from the Ellington mansion casting a golden glow that made everything appear covered in a thin layer of cold shimmer. The party could be sensed from afar, the sound of voices mixed with the soft clinking of dishes, forming a steady rhythm, like the breath of people used to living inside glamour. I walked through the wide open gate, carrying the carefully prepared cake in my hands, and immediately sensed Jade waiting, not to welcome me, but to ensure I didn't step in with a posture she considered overly confident. She approached with a curved smile that anyone perceptive would recognize as strained. "You're here," Jade said, her voice attempting warmth. I looked straight into her eyes, keeping my face free of irritation or judgment. "I came for my grandchild, not for you," I replied, quiet yet weighted. For a brief moment, I saw Jade's expression falter, as if a small flame had been brushed by wind. At the entrance to the dining room, Jade paused. She tilted her head as if recalling something, then spoke with a tone balanced between politeness and a hidden blade. "There's no extra food today, so no need to feel awkward." I heard that sentence the way I had heard thousands of attempts to push me into a smaller space than I belonged. A light line, heavy implication. Calm words, insulting meaning. I answered with a breath that carried its own solidity. "I don't eat leftovers." No raised voice, no wave making. Truth itself creates waves. Jade's eyes flickered with clear irritation. She looked at me as if trying to determine whether my words came from confidence or challenge. But Jade forgot that what I carried was not challenge, but the weight of years spent standing firm on edges others wanted to push me off. I entered the dining room, leaving Jade behind with a smile losing its shine. As soon as I stepped in, Marcus saw me and approached. His eyes carried joy, confusion, and something akin to standing between two winds, moving in opposite directions. My son had always been kind, yet that kindness sometimes made him half a beat slower when choosing the right side. He didn't speak, only placed a hand gently on my shoulder. That gesture had warmth enough for me to know he loved me, yet not strong enough to shield me from what had just been said. Between the mother he loved and the wife he wanted to protect, Marcus had chosen silence. And that silence was the invisible cut I felt deeper than any spoken word. I glanced around the room where lavish decoration gave off an air of coldness. The lights above reflected on crystal glasses, making everything appear coated in a thin veil of distance. I noticed the Ellington relatives looking at me, some with curiosity, others with caution. I understood that none of them were truly comfortable with my presence, not because I had done anything wrong, but because prejudice had seeped into their lives long ago, forming a shell they didn't know how to peel away. I placed the cake on the designated table, then stepped back to watch events unfold. In that bright light, I saw Jade smile again. She whispered something to a family member, both of them glancing toward me. Their smiles were like iron hooks trying to drag me into the position they believed I belonged in. But the stillness in my heart was enough to keep me standing steady beneath their gaze. Marcus returned, about to say something to me, but before he could open his mouth, a voice rose from the kitchen. The chef's voice, clear and firm, like a bell striking the center of the gathering. Top-grade golden lobster to the main table. The atmosphere shifted in an instant, and I knew the real tide of the night had just begun to rise. The atmosphere in the dining room shifted into another rhythm when the chef announced the lobster. I walked in and every gaze seemed to follow an invisible trajectory arranged long before I arrived. The main table glowed brightly under candlelight, long and wide with soft leather chairs, thick tablecloths, and white wine glasses shimmering with golden reflections. That table sat at the center where conversations converged, where the lights concentrated enough for anyone seated there to feel they belonged to the upper tier they were proud of. Meanwhile, my seat was placed in the far corner, where the light dimmed and voices blended into the clinking of utensils. In front of me was a plate of wilted salad leaves, turning a pale yellow, and a glass of cold water devoid of warmth. The contrast wasn't coincidence, wasn't accidental, but a social classification arranged so subtly that an outsider might think it was random placement. I recognized the intention the moment I sat down, and even more clearly when a few relatives glanced at me as though I were a misplaced decoration. On the main tabletop, golden lobster sat on a bright silver tray, each piece positioned like part of a culinary performance. White wine was poured continuously, its sound light as a trembling crystal. The glossy leather chairs made anyone who sat in them feel like honored guests. That scene made my salad seem like a leftover dish from the kitchen, cold, dull, and not intended for someone respected. A relative stared at me for a moment, then turned to the person beside them, speaking softly yet loud enough for me to hear. Not everyone fits fine dining. Their tone wasn't sharp, but smooth, and the smoother it was, the more sarcastic it felt. I rotated the cold water glass in my hand, looked up, and answered with a line that shifted the air by just a degree. Not everyone fits speaking elegantly. No one responded immediately, but eyes shifted and a thin silence appeared between us like a sheet of glass. From the main table, Jade called out to me with a gentle voice, raised just enough for those nearby to hear. She approached with a polite smile so exaggerated it became graceless. "Sit in this corner, okay? The lights at the main table are a bit harsh." The way she said it felt as if she were placing me exactly where she had planned. I looked straight into her eyes and kept my voice steady. Harsh lights reveal who is who. My words weren't loud, but they lingered long enough for Jade to understand I wasn't blind to her intentions. She masked her brief pause by adjusting the tablecloth. Outsiders might assume it was just tidying up, but I knew it was the moment she lost balance and tried to regain it. Around us, utensils continued to clink, yet I sensed the conversation slow. The contrast wasn't only in food or seating, but in how they tried to push me away from the main glow of the room. That light didn't belong to them, yet they believed they possessed it. I observed every detail, from how some relatives gazed at the lobster as if it symbolized their status, to how they avoided my eyes when I looked directly back. Years of stepping through cold, luxurious rooms like this had trained me to read arrogance wrapped in sugar, discrimination coated in manners. The atmosphere made people think they were entering a celebration of a happy family, but each corner of the table held its own undercurrent. Jade returned to the main table, leaned down, and whispered to someone. Her voice was low, yet still reached me, as if her intentions wanted to travel beyond distance and noise. Someone like her doesn't belong at this table. She didn't say it directly to me, but loud enough to cut through the space. And in that moment, I knew the real confrontation of the night had just begun to unfold. I realized the hatred in Jade's eyes didn't come from that night. It had roots, history, an old wound that had hardened before cracking open the moment she looked at me. It wasn't the distant look of a wife guarding her family's territory, but the look of someone who saw in me something that forced her most painful memories to rise. I didn't yet know the origin of that fear, but I sensed it wasn't simple rivalry between a daughter-in-law and a mother-in-law. It was deeper, darker, like a shadow Jade tried to bury under her polished exterior. I was standing near the dessert table when Ellie approached. She had drunk a little wine, not enough to lose control, but enough to soften the walls she usually held up. Her eyes moved from me to the main table, where Jade sat in the brightest pool of light. There was something in that look that told me the night would reveal more than what appeared on the surface. Ellie asked if we could step into the hallway. I nodded, and we walked out of the dining room, leaving behind the sound of clinking glasses and laughter heavy with performance. The hallway was quieter, the golden lights forming broken patches of brightness on the floor, turning the space into a fitting place for truth to surface. Ellie stood facing me, looking down at her hands, as if preparing herself to speak words she had carried for a long time. Ellie began by mentioning a file, the one I glimpsed when the paper slipped from Jade's bag. According to her, it wasn't a random collection. It was a compiled record of nearly 2 decades of Jade's family failures, investments that faltered, business deals her father walked into with hope, only to be crushed without mercy. On one note, Ellie had accidentally seen while Jade was sorting through the file, there was a line written in heavy ink, "Don't let anyone look down on us ever again." It looked less like a reminder and more like a scar that had never healed. I listened as Ellie spoke. The more she said, the more I understood why Jade's eyes carried hostility whenever they met mine. In those stories, someone like me, someone who had risen from years of hardship, became the symbol of everything Jade's family had feared most, the strength of someone who stands back up after defeat. I resembled the figure her father had once faced, but could not overcome. And in Jade's eyes, that figure wasn't a stranger, but a shadow that forced her to relive how her family was pushed aside and left behind. Ellie reached into her bag and pulled out an old envelope, the paper yellowed with time. She said Jade had once shown it to her and asked her to keep it. The letter was written when Jade was 17. The handwriting was slanted and neat, though some lines wavered as if written by a trembling hand. I read the first sentences and immediately understood that Jade's heart when she was young was far more complicated than the woman she later became. I fear strong people. They remind me of how weak my family is. The sentence carried the raw emotion of a child who had watched her parents fail, watched her household sink while others rose above. I folded the letter and returned it to Ellie. In my mind, I saw Jade's expression from earlier when she looked at me across the dining room. That gaze didn't only hold disdain, but fear, the fear of a child whose painful memories resurfaced in the form of her mother-in-law. I understood why she tried to push me away from the main table, why she whispered sharp-edged words, why she feared my presence. Jade didn't hate me. She hated what I reminded her of. Ellie looked at me with guilt, as if torn between loyalty to her friend and honesty to her own conscience. Then she spoke the sentence that struck deepest. "You make Jade feel small, and that's something she can't bear." That line peeled back a layer of her psyche that Jade herself likely didn't want to confront. It wasn't that I tried to appear strong, it was that my strength touched the most fragile part of her. I stood silent for a moment, listening to the wind seeping through the doorway. My mind gathered each piece of information, assembling a picture I had only glimpsed before. Jade's hatred wasn't born from something I did wrong, but from the mirror within her that made it hard for her to breathe whenever I was near. Ellie hesitated, then looked straight into my eyes, like someone about to reveal something worse than the truth she already shared. Her voice lowered, steady rather than shaky. And Jade did something even worse to keep Marcus. The sentence hung in the air, sharp as a blade, opening a door whose contents were still unknown. Ellie stood beside me when we returned to the dining room. She had taken another drink since leaving the hallway, and her steps were lighter than usual. In Ellie's eyes was a restlessness, as though everything she had just revealed remained lodged in her throat, waiting for a small trigger to burst free. The party was no longer as loud as at the beginning, the sounds thinning into delicate conversations and the occasional clink of silverware. I had barely sat back down in the corner when I sensed something shifting in the air. The rhythm of the room changed, as if an undercurrent had reached the edge of the table. Jade remained at the main table, her posture still carrying its usual confidence, yet I saw a tension flicker across her face when her eyes met mine. What Ellie had just told me allowed me to read Jade's expression differently, seeing a thicker layer of defense than usual. That defense wasn't aimed at me alone, but at the secrets she thought she had hidden well. Ellie, on the other hand, had the slight rosy tint of someone who had wine, and her eyes shimmered with long-held emotion coming loose. Ellie didn't stay near me long. Suddenly, she stepped forward toward the main table, her gait unsteady. The party slowed as though someone had turned down the volume, and every pair of eyes turned toward Ellie. I saw Jade straighten in her seat, her hand tightening on her lap like a pulled string. Marcus turned toward Ellie, confusion clouding his expression. Then Ellie blurted out a sentence that dropped the room into a suffocating silence. Her voice was louder than normal, cracking with the emotion of someone who had lost control of her brakes. Jade said, "A person like you eating lobster looks cheap." The words crashed into the room like a hammer striking glass. The entire space froze. The clinking stopped, conversations were swallowed mid-sentence, and every gaze snapped toward Jade as if all of them recognized the truth being ripped from behind its curtain. Jade paled instantly. The confidence she usually wrapped around herself vanished like mist burnt away by light. Her lips parted, but no words formed. I saw in her eyes the desperation of someone exposed at the moment she believed she shone brightest. Marcus stood rigid, eyes wide, his face carrying the expression of someone watching the foundation of his beliefs collapse. He looked from his wife to me, and in his gaze was the clear awareness that the line between love and disappointment had just torn open. The room held its breath for several long seconds. I watched Jade, waiting to see how she would attempt to save herself. And just as I expected, Jade tried to rebuild the mask she had once worn so convincingly. Her voice trembled slightly, smoothed over with forced calm. I was only afraid Mom would feel uncomfortable. Her line resembled someone standing on thin ice trying to step lightly before the surface cracked. But I had seen the fractures long before. I tilted my head, looked straight at her, and said, "No, you were uncomfortable on your own behalf." My voice wasn't loud, yet it carried enough weight for the entire room to hear. At that moment, the air seemed to split again. Jade swallowed, her eyes darting toward relatives, searching for agreement, but the faces around her showed only awkward unease. Not because they cared for me, but because they were being pulled out of the polished comfort they relied on. They weren't used to facing truth this bare. Marcus stepped toward Jade, his shoulders tightening and his breath rising in a sharp wave. I knew this moment would shape many things afterward. He opened his mouth, his voice steady but heavy with meaning. "Jade, tell the truth." The sentence wasn't merely a request, it was a warning. A tear had opened, and I understood that the rest of the night would stretch far beyond anything Jade had imagined. After Marcus's words, the room fell into a silence like a lake swept by wind, then suddenly stilled. Everyone waited for Jade to answer, and Jade sat frozen as if pushed to the edge of a cliff. I saw every trembling breath she took, as though all her defenses had fallen away, and only the rawest part of her was left, trying to hold on to the last trace of composure. Marcus remained standing, his eyes no longer those of a husband protecting his wife, but of a man demanding truth before trust collapsed. Jade drew in a breath, her hands clenched together as if trying to pin her emotions in place. When she spoke, her voice wasn't sharp or defiant, but warped by fear. "I'm scared you'll see your mother is better than me." The words slipped out like a sigh from someone holding something in for too long. Jade lowered her head, her shoulders trembling. "I'm scared of being left behind." For a moment, I saw not the arrogant woman I had confronted all evening, but a young girl haunted by her past and her own insecurity. Yet that fear did not justify what she had done. It explained the cause, not the wrong. Marcus's shoulders loosened slightly, but he still said nothing. He was trying to understand, trying to rearrange the scattered pieces between love and disappointment. But before Jade could speak another word to save herself, Ellie rose abruptly from a nearby chair. Her gaze sliced through the air, the movement so sudden that several guests flinched. The wine in her system loosened whatever restraints she had left, and in that moment, the second truth, the heavier one, burst into the open. Jade said. Ellie looked straight at Marcus, her voice sharp and clear. "If Marcus listens to his mother too much, this marriage will lose balance." The room seemed to tilt again, as if someone had struck the floor. Marcus turned fully toward Jade, his face darkening. I saw his hands clenched tight. But Ellie wasn't finished. She stared at Jade with the wounded look of someone betrayed by her own friend, then delivered the blow that tore the room apart. She also said, "If I have to, I'll make sure Marcus stays away from his mother forever." I heard that sentence and my heart tightened for a beat, not from pain, but from clarity. The clarity of seeing the entire picture finally come together. Relatives at the main table gasped, some covered their mouths, others exchanged looks of shock, while Marcus remained motionless. It was as if the air had been ripped from his lungs in a single moment. Jade shot to her feet, shaking her head, her voice trembling with desperation. "I said that when I was angry. I didn't mean it." But the tremor in her words washed away all credibility. She looked at Marcus with pleading eyes, yet Marcus stepped back, half a pace, enough for Jade to understand something had cracked in him. I stepped forward, not quickly, not forcefully, but enough for both Jade and Marcus to hear every footstep. I stood before Jade, not so close as to intimidate, not so far as to distance. I knew exactly what needed to be said, and I knew this sentence would hit the core of her fear. I looked into her eyes, my voice steady and weighted. "If you have to sever family bonds to keep a husband," I said slowly, "then you never truly had him." The sentence fell, not as an accusation, but as the end of an illusion. Jade froze, eyes wide, lips trembling without words. She understood. Every layer of control she tried to stack, every defense she clung to, collapsed beneath that truth. It exposed what she feared most, that the weakest heart never holds on to anyone by breaking what they love. Marcus turned to me, his eyes filled with hurt and gratitude blended into one. I placed my hand on his shoulder, firm yet gentle, reminding him that truth sometimes must cut it in order to free. As the tension thickened and every gaze in the room pressed onto me, onto Jade, onto Marcus, 3 knocks sounded across the silence. Knock, knock, knock. A man's voice from the doorway said clearly, "I'm looking for Mrs. Calissa Monroe." And the room shifted into a new rhythm. The atmosphere in the dining room tilted the moment after the knocking. All eyes turned toward the entrance. But before the stranger could step in, Evelyn Allington stood up. She walked straight toward me, her posture radiating the cold authority of someone accustomed to pressing others down. She looked at me as if I were the source of ruin, a thorn in a family she believed she had the right to control entirely. I did not step back. I had seen eyes like hers long ago. But this time, I felt clearly she wasn't here to talk. She was here to blame. Evelyn stopped a few steps away, her voice sharp like metal, worn thin from excessive grinding. "My family does not stand on equal ground with someone of low background." The sentence dropped like a blade, meant to strike clean through one's pride. Guests pretended to lower their eyes into their wine glasses, but everyone was listening. Jade held her breath, and Marcus automatically moved closer to me. I looked directly at Evelyn, seeing the exhausted pride in her gaze. Her disdain wasn't simply arrogance, it was fear, the fear of losing her position. I kept my voice steady, each word released slowly enough for her to absorb. "Your family cracked on its own. I only shined a light on the fracture." The room paused. Evelyn glanced around, searching for someone to support her. A few relatives looked away, not because they cared for me, but because they recognized my words had struck at something they all pretended not to see. Jade's fingers tightened, fear flickering in her eyes as the truth scraped through the layers she tried to hide. Evelyn grit her teeth and stepped forward, trying to impose herself. But the closer she got, the more her inner trembling surfaced. Her voice dropped but carried poison. "You came into my family and turned everything upside down. You made my son-in-law fight against his wife." I tilted my head slightly, my gaze unwavering. No one is fighting anyone. People only stand where the truth leads them. Evelyn inhaled sharply, preparing another blow, but Marcus stepped between us. His voice emerged deep and firm, the kind of resolve I had rarely seen in him. "Enough." The room shifted. Marcus turned fully facing his mother-in-law with an expression stripped of hesitation. "From now on, anyone who insults my mother leaves my life." The sentence hit the floor like thunder. No one breathed. Jade reached for Marcus's arm, but he moved away. Evelyn staggered half a step back, her face paling at the words she never imagined hearing from him. I looked at Marcus, my heart tightening from both pride and sorrow. My son, raised with kindness, now stood in the storm of his wife's family, forced to choose. But I recognized he wasn't choosing me out of bias. He was choosing the truth exposed tonight through words, actions, and fractures in the very people who claimed themselves elite. Jade tried to speak, her voice coarse. "Marcus, I did everything for this family." Marcus turned to her, his eyes colder than I had ever seen. Enough, Jade. A family built on insults isn't a family, and no one has the right to pull me away from my mother. Jade froze, her face fading under the lights. Panic flickered in her eyes, the panic of someone realizing the only thread of control she held was slipping. The air tightened. Even the background music felt distant. Guests stiffened, watching the entrance where the knocking came again, a second time, firm and unhurried. Knock, knock, knock. The door opened. Light from the hallway cut a bright line across the floor. A man in a black suit stepped inside, his expression composed, his gaze fixed straight on me. He bowed slightly, his voice clear and deliberate. "I am here for Mrs. Calissa Monroe." And the room seemed to split down the center as everyone realized the next moment would reshape everything that followed. The man in the black suit stood tall at the doorway, the hallway light casting a sharp line across his serious face. The room, already tense like a pulled bowstring, fell into a silence so deep even breathing could be heard. I looked at him and immediately recognized the gaze of someone who had worked with me for years, someone who never appeared unless the matter was important. He stepped forward, scanning the room with calm authority, bringing with him a stillness that made the guests shift uncomfortably, as though they were about to hear something none of them were prepared for. He stopped in front of me. He didn't look at Jade, didn't acknowledge the Ellington family, didn't glance at anyone else. He bowed his head, formal and respectful. "Madam Monroe, the 3 medical projects have all been approved." The sentence hit the room like a heavy weight dropped onto marble, echoing through every corner. Soft gasps broke the air, then vanished. I heard a wine glass tremble in someone's hand, saw the shock rising like steam in the eyes of guests, still trying to grasp what was unfolding. Marcus reacted first. He stepped toward me, his eyes widening as if his whole world had been yanked out of its familiar orbit. "Mom, you're Monroe." His voice cracked, turning the question into something like a plea. I looked at my son, my gaze softening, because I understood the storm he was standing in. I answered gently, "I always was. You simply never asked." The words made Marcus's shoulders falter, as if he suddenly realized the gap he had unknowingly left in his understanding of his own mother. He hadn't been distant, but he trusted the picture Jade painted, believed I was just a simple working woman. He had never wondered about the missing pieces in my life. Jade stood a few steps away. When I looked at her, I saw her eyes straining, as though she couldn't blink, as shock rippled across her face, washing the color from her cheeks. She looked at me, then at the man bowing in front of me, her mind scrambling to make sense of what no longer fit any version of the world she had built. Evelyn Ellington, meanwhile, was completely shattered. She stammered like someone slapped by truth. "You're a billionaire?" Her voice shook like wind against thin glass. I turned to her, my tone calm, but carrying a weight that made the room stiffen. "I'm the one you called cheap." The room tightened. Those who had looked down on me, dismissed me, pushed me into corners, now clung to their chairs as though they might fall off the pedestal they believed themselves to stand on. The eyes that skimmed over me with superiority now filled with fear of their own reflection. Jade stepped back, then another step. The truth slammed into her like a wave against brittle stone. Her eyes no longer held arrogance or disdain or the satisfaction of putting me in the shadows. What remained was collapse, the collapse of a woman realizing she spent years standing on a pedestal built from hollow assumptions. The man beside me continued discussing the projects, but no one heard him anymore. His presence alone declared the truth. The woman they belittled, humiliated, and shoved aside was the one corporations, hospitals, and lawmakers respected, the one they would never have dared touch had they known. Marcus turned to Jade. For the first time that night, his eyes held no anger or heartbreak, but absolute clarity. "You treated my mother like that, and you didn't even know who she was." His voice trembled, but not with weakness. Jade opened her mouth but couldn't form words. I saw in her the remnants of something fragile, terrified, hollow. Not because of my wealth, but because the worst truth had surfaced. She had exposed the ugliest part of herself in front of someone who could see through everything. I stepped closer to her, not in threat, not in superiority, but with the calm of someone who no longer had anything to prove. "I should never have needed to reveal my identity to be respected," I said. "But tonight, perhaps we all needed to see ourselves clearly." Jade's body trembled. Her lips quivered as though she wanted to apologize, but the sound died in her throat. The Ellington relatives behind her bowed their heads, knowing full well there was no justification for what they had done all evening. I turned back to Marcus. My son stood taller, stronger, like someone freed from a shadow he didn't know he had been living under. I saw pain in his eyes, but clarity was growing larger, sharp enough to change him. Then, as I stepped back, the light from the chandelier shifted slightly, illuminating Jade's face just as her knees buckled. No one moved in time. Jade dropped to the floor sobbing, and the room held its breath, waiting to see what would follow. Jade knelt at my feet, her shoulders trembling in waves, her breath broken as if her chest had run out of space to hold any more fear. The room stood silent, no one daring to breathe too loudly. I looked down at the woman who had pushed herself to this ledge, not because of misfortune from others, but from the jealousy and pride she had fed inside herself for years. This was not triumph, but the moment a person must face the consequences of what they sow. And tonight, everything returned to its rightful place. I waited a few seconds, letting Jade feel the weight of the position she once used to belittle others. Some relatives avoided my eyes. Others lowered their heads as if afraid I might see through them. Marcus stood behind me, not stepping forward, not interrupting what I was about to say. He let me lead, and I knew that silence was the greatest respect he could give me. Jade lifted her face, eyes red, her voice raw like sand scraping. "Please give me a chance. I promise I'll change." I watched her for a long moment. I felt no anger, no hatred, only the calm of someone who had seen the truth of everything from beginning to end. Then I spoke, my voice firm but never raised, each word carrying clearly through the room. "If you want forgiveness, serve the whole table the same way you once made me do." The sentence hit the dinner like the final pull of justice's cord. Many guests flinched. Some hid their shock, but Marcus looked at me with eyes bright with pride. Jade froze for several seconds, then nodded hard. She rose slowly, her hands still trembling, but she didn't refuse. She walked to the main table, lifting the largest lobster platter with her own hands, movements awkward yet determined. Then Jade went from table to table, pouring water, clearing plates, serving dishes, each action a piece of proof that she understood what she had done and what she needed to correct. No one spoke during that time, not out of pity, but because they understood this was the only way Jade could learn what she had lacked, most humility. When Jade returned to me, she held the finest lobster dish of the night on a white, silver-rimmed plate. She looked at me, eyes wet. I no longer saw the woman who had once smirked at me in contempt. I saw someone who had finally been taught a lesson she should have learned long ago. Jade placed the dish in front of me with both hands, not rushed, not bowing too low to beg, but acknowledging the truth of her wrongdoing. acknowledging that the place she forced me into was not where I belonged. I looked at her and spoke slowly. Respect is not words, but how you live after. Jade nodded, tears falling onto the table, glowing under candlelight. Marcus stepped beside me, his voice low and full of emotion. Mom is the strongest woman I know. I turned toward my son, and for the first time, I saw the full maturity of a man who knew how to stand on the side of justice, who knew how to love with clarity instead of blindness. The Ellington relatives gradually bowed their heads to me. Not because of money, but because the truth had forced them to shift their perspective. No one dared to insult, no one dared to sneer, because they understood what they had witnessed was not a simple reversal, but the tearing open of true character. I stood and walked away from the table, moving toward Marcus and placing a hand on his shoulder. I didn't need to say much. What belonged to me had already been restored to its rightful place. Jade stood beside us, head lowered, as if awaiting my final judgment. But I had not come to destroy anyone's marriage. What I did was return the true value of everyone's actions. I looked at Jade once more, calm as ever. If you truly want to change, prove it by treating this family the way you want them to treat you. Jade nodded, this time without tears, without trembling, as if she finally understood. And then I stepped toward the door, my footsteps sinking into the silence that made every breath tighten. No one was surprised when I moved toward the exit, but every gaze followed me like watching the steps of someone who had restored order to an entire family. I stopped at the doorway, turned back slightly, and looked at the room one last time. Every eye was on me, waiting, silent. That was the moment I left them with the line that years later they would still remember as the declaration of that night. I didn't defeat them with money, I defeated them with truth. And truth is always worth more than any diamond they wear. The door closed behind me, but the lives of everyone in that room would never return to what they were. As I stepped out of the Ellington estate, the night outside felt strangely quiet. Not the silence of darkness, but the silence that comes after a chapter closes with the sharp fall of truth. The wind moved through the long grass, carrying with it the scent of freedom, of a relief I hadn't felt in a very long time. The lights behind me faded, and I knew that inside that room, every person was facing themselves. Each of them in their own way was beginning to understand the value of respect, of honesty, of the kindness they had once dismissed with a single arrogant glance. I opened my car door and sank into the driver's seat. The rearview mirror reflected my face unchanged, unembellished, yet more peaceful than ever. I rested my hand on the steering wheel and allowed myself a small smile. True peace doesn't come from winning. It comes when you no longer need to prove anything at all. I drove away, leaving behind a mansion that glittered on the surface but hid deep cracks beneath. A new Ellington household would form after tonight, no longer built on false shine, but on the lesson they had been forced to learn in pain. As for me, I had not defeated anyone. I had only defeated the version of myself who once believed silence was the best way to avoid storms. But tonight, I understood the power of truth. It does not need to scream nor fight for space. It only needs to be spoken at the right moment, and the world bows on its own. As the car turned down the road leading to the gates, I whispered into the darkness, a reminder for myself and for anyone who might hear this story in years to come. People can take away the light of a room, but they cannot take away the light of a person. And I let the moonlight guide the road ahead, carrying with it the serenity I have always deserved.